History, African Catholic Studies, the Washington Post, American Magazine, and the National Catholic Reporter. She's a distinguished lecturer from the Organization of American Historians, and she's also an award-winning she also authors an award-winning column, The Griot's Cross, which is published by the Catholic News Service. So we are very fortunate and extremely delighted that she agreed to be our Mary Ward Lecturer this year. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. I hand over to you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon, morning for me, for this lecture. Before I begin my formal remarks, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for this afternoon's event, especially Dr. Louise Nelstrup, for the opportunity to come and to celebrate the still mostly hidden history of African American women religious with this audience in honor of Women's History Month 2022. My presentation today is drawn from my forthcoming book, Subversive Habits, which provides the first full history of Black Catholic sisters in the United States. And it also provides the first full examination of Black sisters' activism and leadership in the long fight for racial, educational, and gender justice within the Catholic Church and wider American society. Sorry. And my book began in many ways as an attempt to make sense of what I consider to be an extraordinary news story and photograph that I stumbled upon in early 2007. At the time, I was in graduate school and I was in desperate search of a paper topic for my seminar in African American history. And I had taken to going through old microfilmed editions of Black-owned newspapers in search of what I believe would be a little-known dimension of the American past. And while scanning through a roll of the Pittsburgh Courier, I actually encountered a 1968 article announcing the formation of a Black Power Federation of Catholic nuns called the National Black Sisters Conference. The article's title alone, Black Sisters Weigh Contradictions in Christian and Secular Community, immediately piqued my interest. However, it was the accompanying photograph of 4 smiling Black nuns that steadied my hand on the microfilm reader that day. Until that moment, I, a lifelong Catholic, had never seen a Black nun, except in a Hollywood film. In fact, the only Black sister that I knew at the time was Sister Mary Clarence, who was the fictional character played by Whoopi Goldberg in the critically acclaimed Sister Act film franchise. Deeply ashamed of my ignorance, I soon learned that I was not alone. Even my mother, who had attended Catholic schools for the entirety of her formal education, and who in 1974 became one of the first 3 Black women to graduate from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, was unaware of the existence of Black nuns in our church. No, only white nuns taught us in our schools, my mother relayed to me on the telephone later that evening. But I wish I had known. I wish we'd had Black nuns in Savannah, Georgia when I was growing up. Stunned by my mother's revelation, I set out to learn as much as I could about the National Black Sisters Conference and understand the roots of the invisibility of Black sisters in our lives. From Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study of the US Black Catholic community, I discovered among many things that there had been Black nuns in my mother's hometown of Savannah, Georgia, but before my mother was born, and specifically before she entered Catholic schools. Before anti-Black prejudice and violent threats pushed these consecrated women out, members of 2 separate all-Black sisterhoods had helped to not only lay the foundation for and ensure the survival of the Black Catholic educational system in the city. I sort of also learned that these women had sort of not only sort of laid the foundation for, but ensured the survival of the Black Catholic educational system. And those efforts had made my mother's journey, and by extension, my own journey into Catholicism possible. Yet my mother conveyed to me that the white sisters and priests who taught her and hundreds of other Black children in Savannah schools during America's civil rights and Black power years had never once alluded to the reality of Black sisters and their lessons. According to my mother, her white instructors had never taught them any African American history or art either. And after calling and writing a host of Catholic institutions, tracking down some of the women who had founded the National Black Sisters Conference, I began to understand why. The saga of America's Black women who dared to be poor, chaste, and obedient is largely untold, wrote Sister Mary Antona Copeland in 1975. It is an uneasy story, not only because it is rooted in the American dilemma, racism, but also because the problem of woman in a traditionally delicate, the problem of woman in an oppressed group is traditionally delicate and strategic. Now, by the time that I interviewed her, Dr. Copeland was a distinguished professor of theology at Boston College and the first African-American president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. However, she had also been out of religious life for 13 years. However, in the 1960s and 1970s, Copeland, who became the first African-American Felician sister in Detroit, Michigan, and later served as an Adrian Dominican sister, had been one of the National Black Sisters Conference's most visible leaders. She had also done more than anyone else to preserve the organization's memory in the face of marginalization and erasure. In addition to publishing the first scholarly article on the National Black Sisters Conference, Dr. Copeland in the early 2000s arranged for the deposit of the organization's papers at Marquette University in Wisconsin. "I'm so glad that you're interested in the Black Sisters Conference," she relayed to me during our first conversation. "We've been waiting on someone to tell this story." Sorry. Now, while Dr. Copeland's willingness to share her experiences with me proved pivotal, it was Dr. Patricia Gray, the National Black Sisters Conference's founding president, and one of the 4 nuns featured in that photograph in the Pittsburgh Courier, from the Pittsburgh Courier, who radically changed the book's focus, my focus, and helped me to see the larger picture. Routinely described by her female and male peers as one of the most intellectually talented and charismatic Catholic sisters of her generation, Gray, who was known in religious life as Sister M. Martin de Porres, had been the NBSC's heart and soul in its formative years. As Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy and the conference's leading public voice, she had also been the face and force of the new Black nun, as they were called in the 1970s. However, in 1974, Gray abruptly departed religious life and stopped giving interviews related to her time in the National Black Sisters Conference and her time as a sister. "I don't like to look back," she frequently repeated during the first of our many conversations over the years. However, after I presented Dr. Gray with the recently published book on Catholic sisters, activism in the Black freedom struggle in the 1960s and 1970s, she quickly changed her mind. Visibly frustrated by the book's erasure of Black sisters' vanguard activism in the Catholic fight for racial justice, its cursory mention of white sisters' longstanding practices of exclusion and white supremacy, and its glaring omissions about the one Black nun briefly mentioned in its pages, the 65-year-old ex-nun quietly stood in her house and departed the room in which we were in. Several minutes later, Dr. Gray returned with a treasure trove, her personal archive from her time in religious life. In handing over the materials, Dr. Gray revealed to me that in the 1970s, the National Black Sisters Conference Executive Board had desired to publish a book documenting Black sisters' history in the United States. She also lamented to me the enduring invisibility of Black sisters' lives and labors in the church and wider American history. Then, in her great wisdom, she gently encouraged me to consider expanding my attention to the mostly unsung and under-researched history of the nation's historically Black sisterhoods. "We, the NBSC, were not the first Black sisters to revolt in the church," she quietly declared. "If you can, try to tell all of our stories." And so in my book, I recover the voices of a group of Black American churchwomen whose lives, labors, and struggles have been systematically ignored, routinely dismissed as insignificant, and too often reduced to myth. For 13 years, I sought the untold stories of the nation's Black Catholic sisters, and I found no accounts bearing any resemblance to the fabled Hollywood tale of Sister Mary Clarence. I also failed to encounter Black sisters whose lived experiences confirmed many of the existing narratives of American Catholicism or the master story of Catholic sisters in the United States. Instead, from a host of widely ignored archival sources, previously sealed church records, and out-of-print books, periodicals, and over 100 oral history interviews, I bore witness to a profoundly unfamiliar history that disrupts and revises much of what has been said and written about the U.S. Catholic Church and the place of Black people within it. because it is impossible to narrate Black sisters' journeys in the United States accurately and honestly without confronting the church's largely unacknowledged and unreconciled histories of colonialism, slavery, and segregation. I address these violent systems of power and their perpetrators, male and female, directly. In so doing, my book recovers an overlooked chapter in the history of the long African-American freedom struggle, a tradition of sustained Black Catholic resistance to white supremacy and exclusion that most scholars argue does not exist. When confronted with a silenced past, I've learned that the greatest responsibility of the historian and the most radical thing that any person can do is to tell the story that was never meant to be told. So my book, Subversive Habits, marks a new starting point in historical truth-telling in the Catholic Church and wider American society. For far too long, scholars of the American, Catholic, and Black past have unconsciously and consciously declared, by virtue of misrepresentation, marginalization, and outright erasure, that the history of Black Catholic nuns does not matter. In offering the first full survey of Black sisters' lives and struggles in the United States, my book unequivocally demonstrates that their history does matter and has always mattered. And at the core of my work, I posit that Black history is and always has been Catholic history. I also turn attention to women's religious life as a stronghold of white supremacy and racial segregation. Indeed, the history of Black female religious life in the United States begins with the successful formation of not only the nation's, but the modern world's first successful communities, Roman Catholic sisterhoods freely open to African-descended women and girls. In the history of the United States, we know that there have been at least 8 Black sisterhoods formed. All were formed in the South, and all but one were or were slated to be teaching communities. That one community that was not a teaching community was a contemplative community, because white contemplative orders would not admit African-descended women who could not pass for white until after World War II. Now, what is significant in the history of Black female religious life in the United States? Although we know that the first African-American women who are documented in the historical record to profess vows did not do so until 1828, I think perhaps the greatest testament to the ferocity with which white communities and white Catholics rejected Black religious vocations is the fact that historians cannot say with any certainty who the nation's first Black Catholic nun was. We do not know her name. We do not know the circumstances of her life, and the realities of racial passing and archival erasure suggest that we may never know those things. What we can say, though, is that those who had professed vows in 1824 were not the first to express a desire to go into religious life. In 1819, for example, a priest from New Orleans, Louisiana, wrote the inaugural bishop of the Louisiana and Florida territories and offered, quote, a few girls of color desiring religious life to support the US branch of the Society of the Sacred Heart, which had been established in the Missouri Territory in 1818. In response, the US superior of that community, who is now St. Rose Philippine Duchesne, responded and expressed a desire to consider admitting these women in order to be able to solve the order's inability to locate suitable servants for their community, and specifically for Missouri's first Catholic school and convent. And although Duchesne did agree that those girls should be admitted and be allowed to wear the regular habit, she suggested that they be admitted at a third-class status below their convert sisters who performed manual labor and the choir sisters who taught in the schools. For his contribution, the bishop of the Louisiana and 2 Floridas said that he would be willing to admit these girls of color who were desiring religious life, but that he could only admit those who were of mixed racial heritage. They had to be both of African and Native American heritage, whom he declared might otherwise be reduced to prostitution. He also suggested that any Black candidates be admitted to some sort of a subaltern profession with a different habit than the convert sisters. He also sort of argued that that had to be done as, quote, to be able to maintain, quote, the last safeguard of morals in the community. For her part, Duchesne's superior, another Catholic saint, did grant the request, provided that it was not known that the girls of colors were members of the society. She wrote, quote, "Do not make the foolish mistake of mixing the whites with the Blacks. You will have no more pupils. The same for your novices. No one would join if you were to receive Black novices. We will see what we can do for them later. We will see later what we can do for them, excuse me. And although nothing seemingly came out of these approvals until 1948, when the community admitted its first Black candidate, not in the South, but in New York City, we know that African-American requests to the Society of the Sacred Heart continued. This community would go on to own over 150 enslaved people. We know that in addition to free women of color attempting to seek admission into the community, at least one of the order's enslaved women who worked with the sisters also sought admission into the community, but was denied. What is significant about this story, though, is that this enslaved woman who will remain close to the community even after she is freed does receive permission to be buried with the sisters, and she is buried with the original sisters in Louisiana, and was allowed to sort of profess sort of an informal vow with the community. And so she was serving with the community and serving in the capacity of a sister, but never allowed to formally join the community. So it will be the formation of Black sisterhoods that make religious life possible for African-American women in the United States. The first successful community of Black sisters are the Oblate Sisters of Providence. They are founded in Baltimore, Maryland in 1829 by servant of God, Mother Mary Lange, who is one of 6 African-Americans who are currently under consideration for canonization within the church. Her story and the story of the Oblate Sisters of Providence is born out of the Haitian Revolution. We know that she was born in Cuba to Haitian parents and immigrated into the United States as a result of the rebellion that was taking place in Saint-Domingue, which became the Haitian Revolution. And upon her arrival in settlement in Baltimore, Maryland, that received significant numbers of free and enslaved refugees from the Haitian Revolution, it becomes necessary specifically for women, lay women who are very much a part of the church, to begin to minister to the largely neglected African descended population there, because the church and most of the schools will not admit Black children into their institutions. We do have a bit more information about the founding members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, certainly from the diary of their male founder, Father James Jobert. What we know is that although they are founded in 1829, he tells us that they waited for more than 10 years before they were able to find a priest who was willing to sponsor a separate community for Black women. He wrote, quote, "For more than 10 years, they had wished to consecrate themselves to God for this good work, waiting patiently that in his own infinite goodness, he would show them a way of giving themselves to him." Now, significantly, Father James Jobert and the Oblate Sisters of Providence do not leave us any information suggesting who were the communities that rejected them. But there were only 3 communities that preceded them in the Diocese of Baltimore and Maryland, which is the nation's inaugural diocese. They are the Visitation Sisters in Washington, D.C., before them, the Carmelites in Baltimore, and then also the Sisters of Charity, founded by Saint Elizabeth Seton, who was the nation's first saint. So it could have only been those 3 communities, and all of those communities are slaveholding communities. The Oblate Sisters are not a slaveholding community. And indeed, the story of Mother Lange and the early Oblate Sisters of Providence provide the essential counterpoints to anyone who wants to suggest or attempt to excuse or defend their slaveholding and segregationist peers as, quote, people of their times. It's always important to remember that Mother Lange and the early Oblate Sisters of Providence, who are not a slaveholding community, are also women of those times. We also know from the historical record that they faced profound resistance, not only from their female counterparts, but also from members of the clergy. Father James Jobert also told us, quote, "I knew already that many persons who would approve the idea of a school for pupils disapproved very strongly that of forming a religious house, and could not think of the idea of seeing these poor girls, colored girls, wearing the religious habit and constituting a religious community." Indeed, we know that many of the founding clergy within the Diocese of Baltimore characterized the potential existence of the Oblate Sisters of Providence as, quote, "a profanation of the habit," unquote. And again, this is significant. When we think about what is happening in the Atlantic world at this time, certainly the center of the Black Catholic community would have been in Brazil, in the Caribbean, where there is significant numbers of Black Catholics, most of whom are enslaved. But interestingly enough, the first community that is freely open to Black women in Brazil, which receives the largest numbers of enslaved people, transported to the Americas as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and that will be home to Latin America's largest Black Catholic community. That first community is not founded until 1928, almost a century after the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And so what is significant about this community, not only is it going to preserve the vocations of Black women who are called to religious life in the United States, but all of the historically Black sisterhoods in the United States will preserve the vocations of Black women denied admission into white and European congregations in Canada, in the Caribbean, and in Latin America as well. That they are multilingual communities and multi-ethnic communities that has often been overlooked. It also reminds us of sort of a great erasure in the story of the American Catholic experience, that there were always two transatlantic stories of American Catholicism, one that begins in Europe and another one that begins with African descended people who are either living in Europe or who are living in Africa. And that transatlantic story is ongoing with the large numbers of African sisters who are coming into the United States now to minister and revitalize communities in the 21st century. Also significant about the Oblate Sisters of Providence, they are not only a non-slave holding community, they are the first US congregation to reject the racist and sexist notion that a woman born into slavery lacked the virtue necessary to enter religious life. Prior to the federal abolition of slavery in the United States in 1865, we know that the Oblate Sisters of Providence will take at least 8 women who were born into slavery into their ranks. And at least one of those women was still enslaved when she was admitted into the community, and she is freed before she's allowed to profess her vows. Of those 8 women, I have shown a picture here of Ellen Joseph West. This is an early Oblate Sister of Providence who was born into slavery and was able to enter the Oblate Sisters of Providence. All of these women enter with their manumission papers, and in the archives today, the community preserves the manumission papers of their sisters who were born into slavery. And this community would found the nation's first not the first successful Black Catholic school, but they currently administer the nation's oldest Black Catholic school. The honor of the person who founds the nation's first Black Catholic school is an early Oblate Sister of Providence, Sister Mary Aloysius Beecraft, who had founded a school for Black Catholic girls, a Black Catholic school for girls in her hometown of Washington, D.C. In 1820 when she was just 15 years old. So many of the earliest Oblate Sisters of Providence were devout lay women who were already ministering to the African-American community, both free and enslaved, who were called to religious life, but in their respective hometowns found no communities willing to accept them because of their color. The second successful community of African-American sisters and the second oldest Black sisterhood, not only in the United States, but in the modern Atlantic world, are the Sisters of the Holy Family, founded by Venerable Henriette DeLille, who was another African-American currently under consideration for canonization within the church. This community is founded in 1842 in New Orleans, Louisiana, although their origins are almost a century, not a century, but a decade before. Significant about the story of the Sisters of the Holy Family, they are the first community of sisters, the first church-approved Roman Catholic sisterhood to minister in the state of Louisiana that was also founded in the state of Louisiana. There are other communities that precede them in ministering in Louisiana, but those communities were all founded in Europe, specifically in France. The Sisters of the Holy Family are the first indigenous community of sisters in the state of Louisiana. And like their counterparts in Baltimore, they are formed in response to the anti-Black admissions policies of the French communities that are ministering in Louisiana in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Also significant about the Sisters of the Holy Family, for the first 40 or 50 years of their existence, we know that the Archbishop of New Orleans or the leadership of New Orleans refused to allow the sisters to wear a religious habit and veil, that they have to sort of win that right until they win that right after the federal abolition of slavery. So here, the only photo that we have of Henriette DeLille, she is wearing sort of the Black dress that the sisters were allowed to adopt after they professed their vows shortly after in 1850, 1851. What we also know is that many of these women were the products of the system of concubinage that was popular in Spanish and French-speaking territories, where European men oftentimes took African-descended women as common law wives. Many of these sisters themselves were also products of that institution, but also were called to religious life in direct response and in direct protest of that system of sexual exploitation and the institution of slavery. We know from the first written history of that community that, quote, all of the first sisters were of the very first families of the city, and only one, Sister Suzanne Navarre, was a stranger from Boston. As for the rest, they were all natives of the state, but their fathers were all foreigners, some French, Spanish, or German. They were all descended from the first settlers of Louisiana. In the case of Henriette DeLille, we also know that she is actually the great-great-granddaughter of one of the founding French royal engineer, who was also one of Louisiana's largest slaveholders. What we know in particular is that his crews of enslaved and free Black men laid many of the earliest roads in New Orleans. They laid the first canals. They also built the old Ursuline convent, which is significant because Henriette DeLille, as a woman of color, would have never been allowed to enter that community because of her refusal to pass for white, but also because of her refusal to pass for white and the community's refusal to admit African-descended women. We also know that they faced profound resistance to their presence in what becomes the Archdiocese of New Orleans as well. Their first historian, Sister Mary Bernard-Dix, tells us that, quote, "We had a very hard time, for we had many enemies who wanted to degrade our dear little community as poor as we were. We were persecuted by the Sisters of St. Joseph of this city. They tried all they could to make us take off our habits. That was after 45 or 50 years that we had worked and suffered to have a religious habit. No one would think we were anything if we were not dressed in the holy habit," unquote. And so after the federal abolition of slavery, when the community finally wins the right to wear habits, we know that the Sisters of St. Joseph, who had arrived in the city after the Sisters of the Holy Family were founded, believed that the Sisters of the Holy Family habit was too similar to that of their lay sisters. And so they wanted to ensure that the Black sisters, the African-American community, was recognized as the lowest rank of the community, as the lowest rank of sisters in the city. And so the sisters had to change their habit to appease the complaints of the Sisters of St. Joseph. That being said, they will establish the first Catholic, and they still administer the nation's oldest Catholic school, second oldest Catholic school, and the oldest Catholic school in Louisiana. Their St. Mary's Academy was also the first Black high school open in the state of Louisiana. They will also establish the nation's first Catholic ministry to the elderly. So their nursing home was the first Catholic nursing home within the entire United States, regardless of color. And they are primarily ministering to, when they are found this nursing home to ex-slaves who were turned out and who were sort of left to die in the streets of New Orleans. And the community will survive and it will grow. Again, it's one of three surviving African-American sisterhoods with us. The third surviving community is founded in Savannah, Georgia in 1916, founded by Eliza Barbara Williams, who had actually spent some time as a superior of a failed community, Black community in Convent, Louisiana, which was an outgrowth of the Sisters of the Holy Family. And we also know from her historical records that she was also for a time a novice with the Oblate Sisters of Providence. The Franciscan Handmaids of Mary are founded in Savannah, Georgia in 1916 in response to a law that was introduced in the Georgia State Legislature, which would have formally and officially barred white teachers from teaching Black children and Black teachers from teaching white children. And if this had passed, it would have effectively barred Black children from the Catholic schools in Savannah, Georgia. In response, a white priest who was ministering in the African-American community in Savannah first asked members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family if they could spare any sisters to be able to ensure the survival of Black Catholic education in Savannah. Those two sisterhoods did not have any members to spare. And so he went in search of a pious laywoman in hopes of founding a religious community to be able to ensure the survival of African-American access to the Catholic educational system in the Diocese of Savannah. He eventually is in Washington, D.C., and he is made aware of Eliza Barbara Williams, who by this time is working as a domestic for the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur at their Trinity College, which is now Trinity Washington University in Washington, D.C. From the historical record, he tells us that he explains what is happening in Savannah She leaves the room for a moment and comes back with her life savings and tells the priest that she will be there as soon as possible. Within 6 months, she has arrived in Savannah, and within a year, she has recruited several African-American women into the ranks to ensure African-American access to the Black Catholic schools, to the Catholic educational system in Savannah. They eventually will be forced out of Savannah due to profound resistance and violence that is being directed increasingly at the African-American community, but also in response to staunch resistance from white Catholics, both religious and lay, who still resent the presence of Black sisters in the Diocese of Savannah. They will eventually relocate to New York City, where they will administer the city's first Black Catholic nursery school, and then administer the city's first Black administered Catholic schools. I do briefly want to mention the Magdalens, which were a contemplative community, an all Black contemplative community that was founded in Baltimore, Maryland in 1922. In response to the refusal of contemplative communities to admit African descended women into their ranks. We know this community in the 1960s integrates with the all-white Magdalens who were connected to the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. I say to the present because there is one Magdalene who is still alive. There are very few records that have survived about the Magdalens outside of these two photographs. But from that Magdalene who was still alive, she was very helpful in assisting me in identifying most of the women who appear in these two photographs that I've been able to find. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, one of the core arguments of my book is that women's religious life is indeed a stronghold in the United States, was a stronghold of white supremacy and racial segregation. And so the fight to desegregate the nation's historically white and white ethnic sisterhoods in itself is a forgotten dimension of the post-World War II African-American freedom struggle. We do know that there are examples of African descended women, most of whom were racially ambiguous or racially indeterminate, who entered white communities in the 19th century. In some cases, they even serve as superiors of white communities. In the case of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the IHM sisters were the first Catholic sisterhood to be established and to minister in the state of Michigan. Their foundress, Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, was actually a founding member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. In 1845, Father James Jobert dies, and the Archbishop of Baltimore attempts to suppress the all-Black Oblate Sisters of Providence. They will survive when a Belgian priest steps in to help save the community. But in the chaos, 3 members of the community decide to sort of leave and found a community in the West, and specifically in Michigan. Only 2 are allowed to go. The third one sort of receives word that she can't come because she's too dark, because it becomes clear to them that they can only found a white community in Michigan. And so they found this community as a white community, and it expands fairly quickly. It expands into Pennsylvania. But certainly in the case of Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, she runs afoul of the bishops who all know her racial secret. She eventually goes into exile and stays with the Grey Nuns of Ottawa, Canada, before coming back into the United States in her later years, dies in Pennsylvania, and then is subsequently erased from the history of the community as their foundress. For the next several decades, the community cites their third member as their foundress, attempting to erase the African-American roots of their 2 original foundresses. And we know that for the next several decades, the community does everything in their power to try to sort of erase and hide their African-American roots. We know that even a few superiors close their records. They close access to the archives. And even when there's an attempt by one priest who sort of learns of Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin and he tries to have her canonized, the community stops him from having access to their records, because their records demonstrate that she was a founding member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, which meant she was a woman of color. Here in 1928, this is one IHM superior sort of acknowledging what they are going to do as they collude to hide any references to their African-American roots, noting that we are convinced that silence is the fairest, wisest, and most agreeable way of committing oblivion to this subject. The Sisters of Charity of New York also have an early Black superior who can pass for white. Her name was Mary Rosina. Her name in religion was Mary Rosina, and she was born Margaret Whiteman, we believe, to either an enslaved or free African descendant mother in Charleston, South Carolina, and an English planter father and slaveholder father. She enters the community, she serves as a superior, she serves in various ranks and then serves as a superior from 1891 until her death in 1894. What we know from the oral history of the community is that after her death, one of her successors went into the archive and tried to destroy everything related to her except her prayer book and rosary. Not everything was destroyed. In the late 1950s, the community interviewed several sisters who had been formed under her because she had also served as an assistant novice directress, and they were able to reconstruct what they knew about her life. And also, as you see here, one photo did survive of her. For Black women who could not pass for white, but who entered white communities in the 19th century, all of these women were forced to leave the United States. They all went to Europe, into European communities that were more accepting of their vocations, although these women were still admitted at an inferior rank, most of them admitted as lay sisters, many of whom would then be reduced to sort of performing manual labor and domestic labor in their communities. This is Frederica Law of Savannah, Georgia, who entered into the novitiate of the Missionary Franciscan Sisters of the Immaculate Conception in Rome, Italy. She was only allowed to train as a lay sister. She becomes very ill and she dies in Rome. She's buried in Rome, but she was allowed to profess her vows on her deathbed. She became Sister Benedict of the Angels. And as I mentioned, she is buried in Rome. This is Frances Johnson of Baltimore, Maryland, who entered into the novitiate of the Franciscan Sisters of Mill Hill in London, England. That community had come into the United States to help minister in the African-American community because most white orders would not minister in the African-American community, and the Black sisterhoods needed help following the federal abolition of slavery. Although she is initially sent to London to be admitted on an equal rank, the community decides for the sake of race relations in the United States that they can only sort of train her as a tertiary. She remains, she takes vows as Sister of Xavier and returns to the United States and labors in Baltimore until her death in 1894. That community will not admit any more African-American women until after World War II. The rest of those women will be sent to the Oblate Sisters of Providence, oftentimes tracked to the Black orders, most notably the Oblate Sisters of Providence. This is Mother Matilda Beasley, who is Georgia's first Black Catholic nun. She founds the first community of Black sisters in Savannah, Georgia, in the late 19th century. We know that she travels, according to the records that have survived about her, because she cannot enter a community in the United States, travels to York, England, sometime before 1885. We believe that she underwent novitiate training with the White Franciscan order there. In 1889, she's back in the United States and she founds the Sisters of the Third Order of St. Francis in Savannah. Her community begins to falter by 1893. And what is significant about her story is that her community attempts to integrate with the recently formed Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament for Indians and colored people. That was its formal name, that was founded by Saint Catherine Drexel. During this time, when she and a superior and assistant in her community traveled to the suburbs of Philadelphia to meet with then Mother Catherine Drexel, that community takes a vote on whether or not they would admit African-American women. And although the annals describe Mother Matilda as a very saintly colored woman, the community sort of cites sort of the unwillingness of sisters to live with Black women on equal terms, and other concerns, other sort of concerns sort of rooted in a bigotry upon their reasons why they will not only not admit African-American women, but not even help provide novitiate training for the community. Also in 1893, they sort of take a vote to not admit Native American women either, which is significant because before Mother Matilda Beasley had gone to Philadelphia, the community had admitted its first Native American woman. They'd only admitted her as a house sister, meaning she was relegated to domestic service. But after Mother Matilda goes and they take the vote, they not only exclude Native American women, not only African-American women, but also Native American women. After that, they tracked their Native American candidates all to white orders that were for the most part, willing to accept Native American women and track their Black applicants to Black orders. Significantly, in their written history and even in sort of the cause for Catherine Drexel's canonization, the community always stated that they did not accept Black women because of a request that had come from Black superiors. The person that they cite, a superior of the Holy Family Sisters, was a superior in the 20th century. They ignore and erase the fact that they had taken this segregationist vote in 1893 and falsely sort of attributed that to Black orders. But it is the story of Mother Matilda Beasley that sort of upends that falsehood. So it's just something to sort of keep in mind, that part of my book is also a work not only of recovery, but also of correction, of really sort of confronting many of the myths that have surrounded not only Black sisters' lives, but that of their white counterparts as well. There will be other examples of white communities that will take Black women. The first U.S. provincial of the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth, which was a Polish community, their provincial adopted at least 6 African descendant girls who were born to white mothers and that were in orphanages. And we know that 3 of those girls became members of that community, but they will not accept any more African-American women until after World War II. I did want to briefly mention, although we will have select examples of African descended women going into white orders, again, that's really not a phenomenon that begins in any sort of earnest. In most instances, that did not mean that that community desegregated. They were just simply willing to admit a racially ambiguous woman as long as she agreed to sort of hide her racial heritage. So we will have other examples of women going into those communities. And I do also want to mention, I say racially ambiguous because Black women did not necessarily have to appear white. White orders would take Native American women. They would take Latina women who were not of African descent. They would take women who were of Asian descent. So you just had to look different. You didn't necessarily have to look white because they did have, that the bar was really anti-Blackness. And even though we do have those examples, I do want to underscore that the vast majority of African descended women who were racially ambiguous, who could pass for white, refused to enter white communities that required that they hide their racial heritage and denied them access to visiting with their families. The vast majority of these women who were given those options went into the Black orders. The group photographs of the African-American orders sort of reveal scores of these women. Their decisions not only ensured the survival of the Black sisterhoods, but it really ensured the great expansion of the faith among African descended people. And I did want to draw your attention to one of these examples. They're one of many examples. This is Rebecca Clifford, who was educated by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, was the valedictorian of their St. Francis de Sales Academy, which was their premier girls' academy for Native American and African-American girls in Virginia. She rejected an offer to enter a white sisterhood in Philadelphia on the condition that she passed for white and cut ties with her visibly Black mother. And she refuses to do so. She instead joins the Oblate Sisters of Providence and eventually becomes their superior. She will be the superior that really leads the charge to help the Oblate Sisters of Providence begin to desegregate Catholic institutions of higher education in order to get their schools accredited during the 1920s and 30s. Significantly, we know from her record, and in this particular case, what happened, she had an older brother who wanted to pass for white, wanted to leave Virginia, wanted to pass for white and enjoy the privileges and rights of whiteness in America that he would not have been able to enjoy as a Black man during the Jim Crow period. And so although he's willing to leave their mother behind, he doesn't want to leave his sister. And so he finds a community, a priest who's willing to sort of find a community that will accept her, and she refuses. And she sort of tells her teachers, quote, that I should not have my mother visit me. I think positively wrong and not the will of God. My mother is making a great sacrifice in giving up her only daughter to God. She is doing it most willingly. Should I impose an unnecessary sacrifice upon her? My decision is that the white people have many to work for them, but the colored people have very few. They are my own people, and I think God wants me to give them the first place, and I don't think I would be blessed if I were to do otherwise. And I use this as an example because, again, she will serve as one of the most powerful and most influential superiors of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, helping to break down some of the nation's most difficult racial barriers in the 1920s and 1930s. But so often we are looking, and we oftentimes are sort of so often examples of African-American women who entered white communities and passed for white are often celebrated or often looked at as sympathetic figures, when in fact they were just simply attempting to distance themselves from the African-American community, when in fact we know that the vast majority of racially ambiguous African-descended women who went into religious life went into the Black orders, but also rejected this notion that there was anything wrong with the African-American community, that they align and declare their allegiance with the African-American community. And so when we have these kinds of conversations, it's important to sort of remember the story of Rebecca Clifford and so many others who serve as essential counterpoints to some of these other examples of Black women who entered white orders as a way to run away from their Blackness, as a way to distance themselves from the social and political concerns of the African-American community. There are other examples of Black women who do enter into white orders, but who refuse to reject their Black families. One early Mary Knowles sister, one of the earliest sisters to go minister in China, was a woman of African descent. We actually know from her records that she told the sisters that she would not be separated from her stepfather and stepsister, who were identified as Black, if she were allowed to be admitted into the community. And they do, in fact, admit her anyways, even though they will not admit their second African-American member until after World War II. Also of note, until recently, the Mary Knowles sisters never acknowledged Sister M. Frances Davis as their first Black member. They always acknowledged their second African-American member as their first African-American member. There are other examples as well of Black women who went into white communities, who never revealed their racial heritage, but who were caught passing for white and were removed. For example, this is Sister Perone Marie, born Mildred Dobert, who tried to pass for white in a community of Religious Sisters of Mercy in St. Louis, is caught and removed. She eventually enters into a visitation community in Richmond, Virginia. They never find out about her racial heritage until I wrote them and told them about her racial heritage. But she was able to successfully pass for white in her community until 1963. But again, most Black women who could pass for white were either rejected into white communities, oftentimes the communities of their educators. And then if they were lucky, they were directed to the Black orders. And that's sort of another big secret about the members of the historically Black orders in the United States. When I began my research, I automatically assumed that these women had been educated by the Black orders that they had entered. And then immediately when I began doing oral history interviews, the sisters would tell me over and over again, oh no, I was educated by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I was educated by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. I was rejected admission into that community, and I got directed into the Black orders. And so during the Jim Crow period, we know that African-descended women and girls called to religious life traveled hundreds and even thousands of miles away from their hometowns to be able to enter communities, mostly the Black orders that were willing to accept them. These are the famous Burke sisters of Louisville, Kentucky. The Burkes would send 5 of their daughters to the Oblate Sisters of Providence, 4 of whom remained. The last Burke sister died just a few years ago. The Prices of Baltimore, Maryland sent 4 of their daughters to the Oblate Sisters of Providence and 1 son to the Josephites, which were a traditionally English community that had come into the United States to minister to the African-American community. Now, while some of these individuals are converts to the faith, many of these African-Americans can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church and the free and enslaved Black people whose labor, faithfulness, and money built it. In the case of the Thomas sisters, 4 Thomas sisters went into religious life. The 3 oldest entered the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary in New York City. The youngest Thomas sister, Josephine, desegregated the Sisters of St. Joseph of St. Mark in Cleveland, Ohio. Their roots are in one of the cradles of American Catholicism in Kentucky. We know that they are the descendants of Mary Eliza Spalding Smith, who was one of the enslaved people owned by the Spalding family, which would give the nation 2 of its earliest Catholic bishops and 1 early foundress of a white community, all of whom were slaveholders. This is the grave site for Mary Eliza Spalding Smith. It's actually in St. Augustine Cemetery in Lebanon, Kentucky, where many of the enslaved people who built the church in the Holy Land of Kentucky are buried, most of whom are buried in unmarked graves. It's also a segregated cemetery. So when you drive into the cemetery, it's very clear on the left side of the cemetery is where white people are buried, and on the right side is where African Americans are buried, both those of whom were enslaved and those who were free before the war, but then their descendants as well who are buried in that space. After World War II, and even during World War II, we begin to see a handful of white sisters and white congregational leaders begin to rethink the morality of their anti-Black admissions policies. Contemplative orders, where members have very little contact with the outside world, are the first to open up their doors or begin to rethink these policies. In 1944, two white sisters, two professed white sisters and one novice will leave an all-white Dominican monastery right outside of Baltimore, Maryland, after their community rejects the applications of two African-American women solely on the basis of race. And they leave the community with the aim of founding the nation's first racially inclusive monastery, which they are finally able to do in Alabama. And almost immediately, they begin admitting African-descended women and other women of color. For apostolic communities, it's really not until after World War II, beginning in the 1940s, but not really until the 1950s, that communities will begin to admit African-descended women and girls. However, the first generation of African-American women and girls who desegregate white communities will face profound resistance. Many of them, like the pioneer members of the Sisters of St. Mary, which are now the Franciscan Sisters of Mary, will only be admitted on a segregated basis. First 5 members, 3 are admitted in July, 2 more in December of 1946. Were not allowed to enter the mother house. And when they finally were allowed to enter the mother house of their community, they only had to enter through the back doors. But the community enforced segregation in eating, dining, and living. They even forced the sisters to profess their vows separately in a segregated profession ceremony. They are not the only sisters who are forced to profess their vows separately from their white counterparts. We also know that priests play a significant role in advocating for African-American women and girls who seek to enter the communities of their educators, or those who simply seek to enter communities in the North. In the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, we know that this community will develop a host of strategies as a way to evade desegregation of their ranks in the United States. I did want to give you one example specifically from the General Council meeting minutes of this community to give you a sense of what is happening. Here, Mother Provincial of the province of Chicago, Mother M. Genevieve Crane, reported that she is being faced with the problem of accepting colored girls as postulants. Mother understands that a priest is sending in an application for 2 colored girls to enter the novitiate. And she asked for prayers for that particular situation. Sometimes priests write all of the provincials in the diocese and archdiocese where they are ministering. In this one example from Harlem, the Reverend John F. O'Brien asked in a letter to all the provincials in New York City, is the order Catholic enough to accept colored vocations? I'm in a colored parish and I'm immediately concerned with this information. And what's significant in the responses is that they are all similar. It's no. But also you begin to get a sense of the kinds of barriers that African-descended women and girls who are called to religious life will encounter as they begin to submit an increasing number of applications into white orders after World War II. In the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, they even sort of write to the Vatican in hopes of trying to find a way to evade the desegregation of their ranks. I do want to end my presentation, though, by focusing on the first African-American to enter the Religious Sisters of Mercy and the one who will remain. She is Sister Cora Marie Billings. She is still alive. In 1956, she became the first African-American admitted into the Religious Sisters of Mercy, and she enters through Philadelphia. Significant about her story is that she actually had 2 aunts who were also educated by the Religious Sisters of Mercy in Philadelphia, but who were rejected admission on the basis of race. And her two aunts entered the Oblate Sisters of Providence, where they remained until their deaths. Their father, Sister Cora Marie's grandfather, is featured here on the left. His name was John Aloysius Lee Sr. He was the second African-American graduate of the nation's oldest Catholic high school in Philadelphia. He was a prominent layman, did significant amount of work to sort of desegregate institutions or make equitable institutions, Catholic institutions within the church. His father, William Henry Lee, was one of the enslaved people owned by the Jesuits at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And I tell this story again, in part to underscore the reality of these women and specifically their deep roots within the American Catholic Church. So many of the Black sisters who desegregate white communities will go on to desegregate a host of other Catholic institutions and American institutions, some of whom are converts, but a significant majority of these women, or a significant percentage of these women, are women who can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church. So I actually want to stop here because I know that we're running out of time and I know that we need to take a break, but I do want to thank you for the opportunity to begin to share some of my research. And I do also look forward to the lecture that will, the questions that will follow. So I'll stop there.